So, in this video essay, I'm going to be exploring the impact that art has in a certain space. Um, so, this is going to range from early European cave paintings to art in the home now, and then moving further into the internet and maybe what the future of that form of art will hold. So if we start with cave paintings, I got kind of hooked on looking at cave paintings maybe about a year ago. The first one I saw, I was just kind of blown away by the dexterity and the skill of the drawing, and also of the narrative that was told. And I think that this narrative is a good place to start. So I was looking at the caves of Chauvet and Lascaux primarily. And what I found is that in cave paintings made during the Aurignacian period about 30,000 years ago, the narrative of life and death seems to be one that pops up a lot. This is usually represented in the form of the hunt, so a predatory animal such as a cave lion is hunting, and you see the various stages of the hunt of some other herd animals such as an oryx or a reindeer. So I think that this is an interesting narrative in the first place because the cave itself is representative of this passage. You know, it goes into the earth. It's a womb space. It's a liminal space that takes you from the outer to the inner, or the inner to the outer. So from life into death, or death into life, potentially. So the process of the making of these caves would have been incredibly interesting, I think, to engage with. So initially, something I want to include is the fact that they were painted by torchlight. And what this does, maybe 2 years ago, I spent about a week living in a teepee with a fire in the centre of it. And something I noticed was that I'd made kind of like charcoal drawings on the walls and things like that. And after a while, I started noticing that in the torchlight, they seemed to shift and move because the power, the intensity of the light, it's not a fixed thing like we have light bulbs. It's constantly shifting and moving, kind of like you have a gig with a light show, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was quite interesting. And also the experience of painting and experiencing the paintings in those caves would have been accompanied with music, because we found instruments in these caves. And I think that the kind of power that this would have had is it would have brought the images to life. And they're already, as I said kind of previously, they're already these incredibly dexterous, beautifully kind of sensory images. And I think accompanied by that, they would have been painted as a community. There's not one artist that's going to be making these images. It's going to be several, and potentially over the course of lifetimes, it's going to be several building and gently kind of working these narratives and these images and these stories that are on the walls of the caves. And as a teenager, I was fascinated by animation, and I read a book called The Animator's Survival Guide by Richard Williams. And something that he first kind of talks about is the fact that in cave paintings you have the earliest forms of movement being documented. So you see images of, say an oryx, a big bull-like kind of animal, and you'd see several legs, several kind of different lines for the hump of the back, so like I'm drawing now, to suggest a sense of movement, which I think then accompanied by the torchlight that they would have been shown under would have been incredibly kind of powerful, and moving, for want of an interesting term. But and I think that this connects quite interestingly. We live in a culture now where we're fed so many realistic images through photography, through social media, through films, videos, whatever, right? And we get quite used to seeing things, and as they develop over time, seeing things become more real or more colourful, bright, powerful, moving, whatever, And I think that in the early days of symbolic imagery and visual imagery being made by people, you know, you can appreciate now that the drawings feel real, they feel moving, but actually then it would have probably been a massive kind of shock to the system. Something where this comes up as well is the Becket windows in Canterbury Cathedral. So after Thomas Becket was murdered in the cathedral, and people started making pilgrimages to come and see his relics, basically, and to become kind of healed. They started telling stories of how people were, these miracles that started happening. So they made a set of windows along Canterbury Cathedral that led you to the relics. And I think that, you know, in full colour at that time, you know, when you didn't have much art in the home, these would have been incredibly moving. So that segues us quite nicely into the Sistine Chapel, which is the next space that I want to explore. And I'm kind of using the Sistine Chapel as a metaphor for holy space, you know, and sacred space, because certainly the caves have a sense of this as well. So first of all, the narrative that's in the Sistine Chapels, especially the ceiling, explores these themes of life and death. And I think the interesting thing here is that a key element of symbolism has changed. Previously, in cave paintings, we were using the life and death of animals, of herd and predatory animals, to show the narrative, to show a narrative about ourselves, about those animals as well. Whereas now, in the Sistine Chapel, what we find is the symbol, the metaphor, the motif is human. You know, in a way that during the kind of Aurignacian period, you weren't seeing kind of realistic humans being drawn. We knew that they could draw kind of realistic figurative images, but actually humans pop up as stick figures, or if they are, they're then combined with animals, but we're not given humans. So in this, it makes a big difference, because the one thing about the Sistine Chapel is you have, you know, as you walk in and you crane your head back and you look up the 60 feet to the ceiling, suddenly there is this huge figure of God, rippling muscles, an outstretched finger. It's an insane kind of image of human, you know, the kind of perfect form, I suppose, of the High Renaissance. But and I think that this maybe shows that our viewpoint as humans, you know, originally maybe we were seeing ourselves as these animals, you know, as the animals that we were engaging with in life, you know, that we were watching hunt the same animals as us. And then suddenly you get the Sistine Chapel and humans are the central talking point. They're the motif. They're the thing that directs the story. So I think that's a fascinating change. So an interesting thing is that the Sistine Chapel's process for painting was probably quite similar to the cave paintings that we see. So they would have worked long into the night. They'd have been mixing their pigments on site up in the kind of eaves of the roof. And it would have been slow and laborious kind of work, I suppose, in a what could be kind of felt as quite a, you know, the artists painting the Sistine Chapel were 60 feet in the air, you know, and in caves you're met with so many different high-ceilinged, low-floored rooms, and quite often they're painted high up on the ceiling, you know, so that as you're walking around the cave you look up, and there's that sense of kind of deference to the images that I suppose is what Michelangelo was going for in the Sistine Chapel. So yeah, and they would have, you know, in cave paintings, if you were painting on the ceiling, they would have used kind of these simple supports and scaffolding, I suppose. So I'm just doing a little sketch now just to illustrate that actually there's not too much in terms of the difference of the process, but the image and the narrative is kind of hugely different, I suppose. So Yeah, and I suppose the key thing I'm trying to say here is that they both share a dramatic space, a moving space. You know, the Sistine Chapel is huge, and uh, it's you know, it's a kind of man-made feat of power, as are most cathedrals. Um, I suppose in the effort to kind of make it feel non-man-made, you know, to make it feel kind of sacred or bigger than human. And the same thing kind of happens in caves. You know, they're not made by humans, but they are insanely beautiful, mysterious, strange kind of spaces. So, and again, it's suggesting that connection between life and death and whatever happens afterwards, which has probably been a big question on our minds for a long, long time. So, I think that you know, the combination of these things suggests how our means of experiencing art and our means of creating art have changed kind of over the course of it's a massive chunk of time. You know, previously we were engaging with maybe nature, including animals, including the landscape, on a more one-to-one basis, whereas by the time we get to Michelangelo's time and the painting of the Sistine Chapel, something has definitely shifted. There is definitely a weightier focus on the human and less interest in the natural or in the kind of animals that we're experiencing our lives with. This is probably due to things like kind of farming becoming a normal thing, you know, and we're slowly over time dominating, certainly Europe, starting to dominate most of the landscape to the point where there isn't much wildness left, really. And you know, we have a shift also in terms of who's the central figure of these narratives. You know, it seems to be the predator in the cave paintings. You know, this kind of these powerful pack of cave lions working together, and then in the Sistine Chapel, in the ceiling, it's God. You know, and it's God and Adam and humans being created. So the next thing that we're going to come on to is the impact of art in our homes. So, and there is evidence that certain caves were lived in permanently and painted, but mostly they seem to be specifically for kind of ceremonial use. The same with the Sistine Chapel, you know, that it's a space that's for a sacred use, but it's not somewhere where you'd kind of live permanently unless you're, you know, the committee of people deciding the popes. So, and I think that brings us on to an important point in our history where suddenly we are surrounded by art in our homes. You know, the invention of the camera means that we can have photographs of our friends and loved ones, and we can have paintings by our favourite artists or by our friends who are painters, or you know, the whole kind of range. And I think that the important thing here is it's this reminder of kind of humanity. If it's an image of your favourite place, your favourite people, or in you know, a certain time in your life, it triggers that feeling of experience, you know, that reminder of your humanity. And if it's a painting of something that you engage with, there's a human touch in there, but it's also, all art to some level is about the emotion that we experience, and it's a recognition that that emotion is valid, you know, that's an important part of our experience. And yeah, like I'm writing now, so the touch of the artist, you know, the physical piece of brushwork, I think that's why those early cave paintings are so moving as well. Those hands printed or kind of blown onto the rock, and you see, you know, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed in 30,000 years, which is, I think, an insane thing, really, because quite a lot has changed too. And it also, you know, by having art in the home, it tells your guests who you are, you know, and what you stand for. And I think that this is probably also the case for both the cave paintings and the Sistine Chapel. So there are theories that actually in these caves, across northern Spain and kind of southern France. Part of the reason for painting the caves was so that when people were traveling through, if they experienced these caves, they'd know what came before, who has been living here, what has been living here in terms of the wildlife, and they're like a record book. And the same goes for the Sistine Chapel. It is very clear who the occupiers of that space are. It's very clear that there is a deference. It's huge and powerful, and these images of people who are massive and far more muscular than most people would be. There is obviously a hyperbole going on that means that it's an important space. So yeah, and part of what we see in the chapel in the ceiling is the story of the Book of Genesis as well. There's a narrative being told, and the narrative is for a reason. It's to remind you of why we're here, and I'm sure, but the same kind of went for the cave paintings as well. And something we see as well is that in the Sistine Chapel, a kind of key element of Catholicism is Jesus, I suppose, and the return of Jesus. But actually, we don't see that in the ceiling. In the surrounding walls, we do. But the kind of key element of the Sistine Chapel ceiling is that it lays the foundation for that narrative, which then comes in closer to the people, I suppose, is the argument. So another thing that we see in art that's in the home is that it detracts from the pure kind of functionality of the space. So it isn't just the space as a role as a place for you to live in, for you to eat, and to kind of just subside, but actually it's a space for creation. It's a reminder that creation has happened and that it will happen in that space, which I think is incredibly powerful when you're sharing it with other people. If your art's filled with, if your home is filled with art and music, then it's likely that's what will kind of come out of the space. And yeah, it makes the statement that you believe that art is worthwhile, that it's important in our lives. And I think that there is always that kind of question of, where do you find that balance between creativity and functionality? And I think by including art in your home space, you're acknowledging that engagement between those two things can go on, And also, the narrative in all the images that you have in your home, in all the images that are in the Sistine Chapel and in these cave paintings, they, whether kind of consciously or subconsciously, they tell a narrative. And everyone's going to read that differently depending on their own experiences, but you read the narrative of your experiences. It tells about your life and the things that have engaged you, that have connected to you. And where does it appear in our lives now? It appears in films. This narrative, this storytelling, something that has been such an ancient practice in humans. Part of the importance of our verbal language is that we can tell stories. And whether to learn from these stories, whether to act on these stories, or just for kind of enjoyment. This is something that has existed for a long, long time in humankind. And I think that's a really interesting place that this comes in now in terms of art and in terms of, going back to this idea of drawing and painting, is through animation, through Disney and Warner Brothers, and animators like Milt Kahl and Art Babbitt. And what you have here is storytellers telling stories through drawings. And I think that's an incredible step, especially if you go back to those early cave paintings where actually that's what they were doing. And mostly, you think about Disney and Warner Brothers and they're taking animals. It's the same it's the same characters, but the stories have developed, the stories have changed, of course. Okie dokie, so moving on. In a world of pandemics and the internet, what does this mean for art that isn't viewed in a physical space? You know, in terms of this world where over the last year we haven't been able to leave our physical spaces so much, and have, you know, and I'm sure it's a kind of shared consensus that we've all looked at our computer screens a lot more, you know. And what does it mean for the art that we still view? You know, we're still seeing gallery exhibitions and still seeing music videos and music, but they're online. You know, this art is online, always in your home, always in that space, but it's not necessarily curated for your home in the way that you put up paintings or pictures of people, because our computer space is constantly changing. The internet space that we explore is constantly changing, and it you know, and it does link to infinite amounts of work, and I wonder whether this adds value to the work, and there's part of me that feels that maybe it doesn't. In a world of social media, where, you know, in terms of things like Instagram, where images are passing you by constantly, they are, you know, if you scroll through an Instagram page, potentially within 5 minutes you get 20, 30 images that you've just been given. And I don't know whether this gives us enough time to really absorb all of the images, or whether it just kind of fills our consciousness with flashing kind of narratives that don't necessarily connect. I think this also makes it harder to recognize what really resonates and what makes you feel. And I wonder whether this will change as we come back into a world where we can go to galleries again, we can go to the cinema, we can go to these spaces held specifically for art, and for film and for music, and whether that will mean that actually as a culture we value them more because of this year not being able to do that. So if we go into this study, basically what happened is they were looking into whether art in person in a gallery space or art online had more of an impact. So they had 25 artworks to be viewed, and they invited these students to attend. So initially, the first group that they chose looked online first, and then after they'd done that, went to the museum and saw the same pieces. The response from the students that saw these found that the museum was more stimulating compared to the online gallery. So then they took a second group and they said, okay, you can go to the museum first and then you can look at it online. And what they found was that, again, the museum work was still stimulating, it was still engaging, but the online, because they'd already seen the museum, was even less engaging, even less stimulating than the initial group had found the online work. So it shows that kind of in comparison to museums, work and in comparison to a gallery space where it's been created to hold the work, it's not as moving, it's not as powerful. And that might be something to do with the human touch again, you know, being able to see the artwork in person, being able to engage with its creation as well as the image and the narrative that's given to you right there. But they found that physically seeing it made a huge impact. And the other thing that this gave is it allowed the gallery space to be used as a mnemonic for remembering the images. So it kind of connects to that idea of the mind palace, where you have something to remember. So you visualize going down a corridor or opening a door to a room and then putting it somewhere, putting that information somewhere, and that enables you to then go back and engage with it and remember it as well. So that, and they found that happened in the gallery. So as people were walking around, they remembered the rooms that they went into, they remembered the changing into the rooms of what paintings were coupled with other paintings, And this meant that they found it easier to engage. You know, you're getting maybe more of a narrative, and this is where narrative comes in as an important thing in making kind of powerful work. Is the narrative isn't just in the image. The narrative is in the experience of the image, in the way you go into it. The narrative's in stepping into someone's home and seeing the paintings on their walls and talking to that person, engaging with them about the images on their walls. And presumably the same with caves and with the Sistine Chapel as well. So I suppose we come back to that question of the art as an internet element isn't going away anytime soon. So how do we make it more engaging? How do we get it closer to the level of engagement that you find walking into a cave, walking into the Sistine Chapel, walking into someone's home and looking at their artworks? I think that probably something that will play a huge role in this is virtual reality. So an experience that I had when initially looking up these caves. So the first thing I had to confess is that I haven't seen these cave paintings in person. I'm not entirely sure that matters because they've had an impact on me, but the way that I viewed them was being able to go online and look up the websites of the caves of Chauvet and Lascaux, and they have these virtual tours, I suppose, where you can go in and they've shot each room with a kind of 360-degree camera. And you can explore and you can move through and you can click on things, you know, and get information about it in the way that you would probably, you know, a guide would take you around and they'd give you information about it. I found this pretty engaging, maybe even more so than a kind of tour of a cave itself, because there's no rush. You know, I spent, you know, several hours initially exploring these caves, looking at every nook and cranny, looking at the stuff, the debris that's left on the floor, each of the images and the way that the images compiled together as a narrative. So one of the things in the Lascaux cave is that you have a wall where they're showing this cave lion hunt, and the narrative's told, and depth and perspective are told using the different walls that come out. And I haven't seen this in person, but I got a sense of it by moving around this virtual reality, I suppose, space. And I think it was engaging. You know, it's obviously had enough impact for me to want to write a video essay about it. So, yeah, so that's really interesting. So I think the next form of interesting online artwork, just as a means of talking about, you know, another way to engage with artwork in the online realm, in that space, is NFTs. So these are a form of cryptocurrency, and the name stands for non-fungible tokens, so they can't be exchanged for something else. And essentially what this means is it's trying to create another platform for being able to sell work, and it kind of the most important thing here is that any digital work at all, so it can be art, music, combinations of the two. It could be a web page, it could be an article, who knows. You could sell just a picture of your face as one of these, and basically what it becomes is currency, and with that can increase or decrease. So it's been created out of the kind of need for a new form of selling work, selling online artwork, and giving people the chance to own the work. So it's a peer-to-peer platform, which means that there's no middle person, basically. There's no distributor. It's just the person making the work selling to the person buying the work. And in theory, this makes it ownable. Of course, that's a kind of realm where, you know, you can download most videos on the internet, you can download most images, but to own and to have a record of that ownership, you'd have to do it through this kind of method. So whilst this isn't really about art in the space, I think it's an interesting concept for looking at where art in space might go in the future. in particular into these kind of virtual gallery spaces. So I suppose the next question is virtual reality. And this is something that I found fascinating. My brother, over the last couple of years, has kind of got himself kitted out with the full virtual reality kind of setup. And I initially, I said, okay, yeah, I'll give it a go. And he put me into this world where you're kind of plonked underwater at the bottom of the sea, which is a kind of terrifying concept for me anyway. But you're put there, and then you are fully immersed. You are physically. As far as I'm concerned, I was under the sea. You can't touch anything. You can't engage with it on that level, but you can be there. You can feel as if things are close or far away. You can feel the kind of presence of whatever elements are put into the virtual reality. And I think that this could be a way where, potentially online galleries can be created and made really engaging. Because again, if you created a space that you could move through in a virtual reality setting, potentially that kind of mnemonic element would start coming into the space, and you'd be able to engage and remember those artworks in a kind of more powerful, more resonant way. So to kind of bring it all together, I suppose the thing that really interested me was how different, on the surface level, you look at cave spaces and you look at the Sistine Chapel and these glorious, powerful, magnetic, moving spaces, and then you compare it to something as simple as just your living room with pictures of your family, and there's a big difference. There's a big gap there, in terms of the presentation of the work. But actually, maybe a similar thing is going on, and I think that probably comes back to the narrative, not just the narrative in the images, but the narrative that's told with the space. The fact that the caves were created not by man, but by the earth, by the fact that the Sistine Chapel was created by man, and it has that power, and the fact that your own home is your narrative. It's the space that you live in, the space that you take up and you change and you shift within, and you grow, and your narrative develops within. And I think that no matter what the space, that's going to happen. The only time where that starts to disappear, I think, and change into a different realm is when it comes into the online sector. But I'm sure that over the course of the future and time, this will probably also have its own narrative. It'll have its own means of engaging with the space.